Sometimes the hardest journey isn't the one through snow and ice, but the one back to the people we've lost. Mason Teller, a 55-year-old cowboy, is crossing a frozen valley when he finds an old stagecoach buried in deep snow, no tracks anywhere near it. Inside, there's a trunk holding a child's quilt, a worn journal, and a locket with a photograph of a young woman. The face in that locket looks exactly like his estranged daughter. What he discovers will take him through winter terrain and forgotten memories, searching for answers about his family's past and the daughter who left years ago without explanation. Could this frozen carriage hold the key to understanding why she disappeared? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other winter day in the high country. Mason Teller woke before dawn in his small cabin at the edge of the Bitterroot Range, the kind of cold that settled into your bones, greeting him as he pushed back the heavy quilts. He was 55 years old, with hands that told stories of decades working rope and leather, and a face weathered by sun and wind until it resembled the canyon walls he'd ridden past all his life. His hair, more silver than brown now, stuck out at odd angles until he ran water through it from the basin by the window. The cabin was simple, but well kept. A wood stove in the corner, a table he'd built himself 30 years back, shelves holding tin cups and plates, a few books with cracked spines. On the wall hung a photograph in a simple frame, Mason and his wife Clara on their wedding day, both of them young and full of hope. Next to it, a smaller photograph showed a little girl with dark braids, maybe 7 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. Mason's daughter, Sarah. He didn't look at that photograph much anymore. It hurt too much. He dressed in layers, wool shirt, canvas jacket, leather vest, and pulled on his boots, the same pair he'd been resoling for 15 years. Outside, the world was painted in shades of white and grey. Snow had fallen through the night, covering everything in a fresh blanket that sparkled in the pre-dawn light. The air was so cold it made his lungs ache, but Mason had long ago made peace with mountain winters. They were hard, yes, but honest. They didn't pretend to be something they weren't. His donkey, Copper, stood in the small lean-to beside the cabin, his breath coming out in great clouds of steam. The animal was getting on in years 12 now, but still sturdy and reliable. Mason had never been much for horses. Too high-strung, too unpredictable. Copper was different, steady, patient. The kind of companion a man could count on when the trail got rough. "Morning, old friend," Mason said, running a hand along Copper's neck. The donkey's ears swiveled toward him, and he let out a soft bray. Mason smiled, one of the few genuine smiles that crossed his face these days. I know. You're hungry." He forked hay into the feeding trough and checked the water bucket, breaking through the thin layer of ice that had formed overnight. Copper ate with the methodical patience that characterized everything he did, while Mason stood beside him, watching the sky begin to lighten over the peaks to the east. It had been 3 years since Clara passed. Cancer, the doctors in town had said, though by the time they'd figured it out, there wasn't much to be done. She'd handled it the way she'd handled everything in life, with grace and quiet strength. Even at the end, when the pain must have been considerable, she'd squeezed Mason's hand and told him she'd had a good life, that she had no regrets, except one. "Find Sarah," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. "Before it's too late. Find our girl and bring her home," Mason had promised. He'd meant it, too. But 3 years had passed, and he was no closer to keeping that promise than he'd been the day Clara died. The truth was, he didn't know where to begin. Sarah had left 8 years ago, left without explanation, without goodbye, without giving him any way to reach her. One day she was there, the next she was gone. Just 22 years old, and she'd vanished like morning mist. He'd tried to find her, of course. Asked around town, talked to her friends, even hired a man who claimed he could track people down. Nothing. It was as if she'd decided to erase herself from their lives completely. The not knowing had nearly killed Clara. It had certainly changed her, made her quieter, more withdrawn, and it had done something to Mason, too hardened something inside him that used to be softer. The worst part was that he didn't understand why. There'd been no fight, no falling out, nothing he could point to and say, "That's when it went wrong." Sarah had always been a thoughtful child, maybe a bit too serious for her age. She'd loved books and drawing, spent hours by herself exploring the woods around their property. But she'd been happy, or so Mason had thought. She'd smiled, laughed, hugged them goodnight, and then she was gone. Mason shook his head, trying to clear away the memories. They didn't do any good, just made his chest feel tight and his eyes burn. He had work to do. He was heading into town today, Coulter's Ridge, about 12 miles northeast through the valley. He needed supplies, and he had some pelts to trade at Hanson's general store. The trip would take most of the day there and back, especially with fresh snow slowing them down. He loaded Copper's panniers with the pelts he'd been preparing, marten, fox, a couple of beaver. Not a fortune, but enough to get him through another month or two. He added a bedroll and some jerky, just in case the weather turned and he needed to hole up somewhere along the trail. The mountains had taught him, long ago, that a man who didn't prepare for the worst was a fool. The sun was fully up by the time Mason led Copper out of the lean-to and started down the trail. The snow crunched under their feet, and overhead a hawk circled on the thermals, hunting for anything foolish enough to move in the open. Mason watched it for a moment, admiring the efficiency of its flight. Nothing wasted, every movement purposeful. The trail wound through stands of pine and aspen, following the contours of the land. Mason knew every turn, every rock, every place where the creek ran close enough to the path that you could hear it bubbling under the ice. He'd been making this journey since he was a young man, first with his father, then alone, then with Clara, and finally, for a few precious years, with Sarah riding beside him on an old mare they'd called Daisy. Those had been good years. The best, maybe. Sarah would chatter away about everything and nothing, pointing out animal tracks in the snow, asking 1,000 questions about the world. Mason had loved those conversations, loved seeing the world through her curious eyes. She'd made him notice things he'd stopped seeing, the way ice formed in perfect crystals on pine needles, the sound different birds made at different times of day, the patterns stars made in the winter sky. He missed that. Missed her. More than he could put into words. The trail descended into a wide valley, flanked on both sides by steep ridges. This was open country, exposed to the wind, and the snow here was deeper, undisturbed, except for the occasional track of deer or elk. Mason pulled his scarf up over his nose and mouth, squinting against the glare. Copper plodded along behind him, as unbothered by the cold as ever. They'd been walking for maybe 2 hours, when Mason saw something that made him stop. Off to the left, maybe 100 yards from the trail, was a dark shape in the snow. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree or a boulder. The valley had plenty of both, but there was something about the way it sat there, something too regular, too intentional. He stood still, studying it. Copper came up beside him, ears forward, interested but not alarmed. Mason trusted the donkey's instincts. If there was danger, Copper would let him know. "What do you think, boy?" Mason asked quietly. "Worth a look?" Copper snorted, which Mason took as agreement. He turned off the trail, breaking through the deep snow toward the shape. As he got closer, his curiosity turned to puzzlement, then to outright confusion. It was a stagecoach, an old wooden stagecoach, the kind that hadn't been common in these parts for 30 years or more. It sat tilted slightly to one side, half buried in snow, its wheels frozen in place. The wood was dark with age and weather, and icicles hung from the roof like teeth. But what struck Mason most was this. There were no tracks leading to it, no tracks leading away from it, nothing but smooth, unbroken snow in every direction. He circled it slowly, Copper following. The doors were closed. The driver's bench was empty, covered in a thick layer of white. Everything was still, silent, except for the wind moving through the valley. It felt wrong somehow, finding something like this out here in the middle of nowhere. Like stumbling across a piece of the past that had no business being in the present. Mason approached the door cautiously. His hand went to the knife at his belt, not because he expected trouble, exactly, but because a man didn't survive 55 winters in the mountains by being careless. He pulled the door open. The hinges creaked, and snow tumbled from the roof onto his shoulders. The interior was dark, musty, untouched. A single trunk sat on the floor, its leather straps still buckled, a thin layer of frost covering its surface. Nothing else. No bodies, no supplies, no explanation for how or why this coach was here. Mason stared at the trunk for a long moment. Every instinct told him to walk away, to get back on the trail and continue to town as planned. This wasn't his business. Whatever story this coach held, it was old and done with. But something made him stay. Maybe it was the simple mystery of it. Maybe it was the way the trunk sat there, so carefully placed, as if someone had wanted it to be found. Or maybe it was just that after 3 years of grief and loneliness, after 8 years of not knowing what happened to his daughter, Mason Teller needed something, anything, to break the monotony of his days. He reached down and unbuckled the straps. They were stiff with cold but came loose easily enough. The trunk's lid lifted with a soft creak, and Mason found himself looking at contents that made no sense at all. A child's quilt, hand-stitched with care, the fabric faded but still showing traces of blue and yellow flowers. Beneath it, a leather-bound journal, the pages yellowed with age. And tucked into the journal's cover, a silver locket on a delicate chain. Mason picked up the locket with fingers that had suddenly gone numb. He fumbled with the clasp, finally getting it open. Inside was a photograph, one of those old tintype images from decades past. A young woman looked out at him from the sepia-toned picture, her face serious, her eyes direct. She wore a simple dress, and her hair was pulled back in the style of another era. But it was her face that made Mason's breath catch in his throat. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the way she held her mouth, it was Sarah, or someone who looked so much like Sarah that it couldn't possibly be coincidence. His hands started to shake. He stared at the photograph, then at the journal, then at the quilt, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This trunk, these items, they had to be 70, maybe 80 years old. But the face in that locket was his daughter's face, or her grandmother's face. Or Mason closed his eyes, took a deep breath of cold air, and tried to think. There had to be an explanation. His wife's family, maybe. Clara had come from old stock in these mountains. Her grandmother had passed long before Mason met Clara, but there had been stories, fragments of family history that Clara's mother used to tell. Something about a woman who'd gone missing, a tragedy no one liked to talk about. He opened his eyes and looked at the photograph again. The resemblance was impossible to deny. And if this woman was Clara's grandmother, Sarah's great-grandmother, then what was her trunk doing here, in an abandoned stagecoach, in the middle of nowhere? Mason carefully placed the locket back in the journal and closed the trunk. He stood there in the snow, Copper waiting patiently beside him, and felt something shift inside his chest. It was curiosity, yes, but more than that. It was the first spark of purpose he'd felt in 3 years. Clara had asked him to find their daughter. He hadn't known how to start. But maybe, just maybe, this frozen carriage held a clue. Not about where Sarah was now, but about where she'd come from, about the blood that ran in her veins and the history that had shaped her. Maybe understanding the past was the first step toward finding the future. He lifted the trunk, it wasn't heavy, and secured it to one of Copper's panniers. The donkey accepted the extra weight without complaint. Mason took one last look at the stagecoach, trying to memorize every detail, then turned back toward the trail. The trip to town suddenly felt more urgent. He needed to talk to someone who knew about the old days, someone who might remember stories about missing women and mysterious disappearances. And he needed to look through that journal, to read whatever words the woman in the locket had written. As Mason and Copper made their way back to the trail, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of more snow. But for the first time in a long time, Mason Teller felt something other than resignation. He felt hope, fragile and uncertain, but real nonetheless. The frozen carriage had appeared in his path for a reason. He was sure of it now, and he was going to find out what that reason was, no matter how long it took or how far the trail led. Coulter's Ridge hadn't changed much in the 30 years Mason had been coming here. Main Street ran straight through the center of town, lined with false-fronted buildings that had weathered countless winters. Hanson's General Store sat on the corner, its wooden sign creaking in the wind. The saloon, the telegraph office, the small church with its white steeple, all familiar, all exactly where they'd always been. In a world that seemed to change faster every year, Mason found comfort in this constancy. He tied Copper to the hitching post outside Hanson's and unloaded the pelts, leaving the trunk secured to the pannier. He'd deal with that later, after he'd finished his business. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and warmth from the pot-bellied stove washed over him. "Mason Teller," called out Jakob Hansen from behind the counter. The shopkeeper was a decade older than Mason, with a white beard that reached his chest and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. "Thought you might be snowed in this month. Takes more than a foot of snow to keep me from trading," Mason replied, setting the pelts on the counter. "Got some good ones this time." Jakob examined each pelt with practiced hands, checking the quality, the curing, the condition of the fur. He nodded approvingly. "Fine work, as always. What do you need in exchange?" They settled into the familiar rhythm of bartering coffee, flour, dried beans, a new whetstone, some kerosene for the lamps. Jakob threw in a tin of tobacco without being asked, which Mason accepted with a nod of thanks. It was how things worked out here. Kindness repaid with kindness, respect earned over years of honest dealing. "Say, Jakob," Mason said as the shopkeeper wrapped his supplies, "you ever hear stories about someone in these parts going missing? Long time ago, maybe 70, 80 years back?" Jakob paused, his hands stilling on the brown paper. "That's specific. Any particular reason you're asking?" Mason hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding it. Jakob had known him too long to be fooled by evasions. "Found something out in the valley. An old stagecoach, abandoned, had a trunk inside with some personal items. Made me curious about the history." "Stagecoach, you say?" Jakob's eyebrows rose. "That is peculiar. Those haven't run through here since before the railroad came. As for missing people, well, the mountains have claimed their share over the years. Harsh land doesn't forgive mistakes." "This felt different," Mason said. "More deliberate somehow, like someone meant for that trunk to be found." Jakob tied the package with string, his expression thoughtful. "You might want to talk to Agnes Fairchild. She's the oldest soul in Coulter's Ridge now, must be near 90. Her memory's still sharp as a tack. If there's a story to be known about the old days, she'll know it." He paused. "Lives in the blue house at the end of Maple Street. But Mason, sometimes the past is best left buried. Not all stories have happy endings." "I'm aware," Mason said quietly. He loaded his supplies onto Copper and considered his options. It was past noon already, and the ride back to his cabin would take the rest of the daylight. But the trunk called to him, and the face in that locket haunted his thoughts. He made a decision. "We're staying in town tonight, boy," he told Copper, leading him to the livery stable. "I've got questions that need answering." The stable owner, a taciturn man named Birch, accepted payment for overnight boarding and promised Copper would be well cared for. Mason retrieved the trunk and made his way to the Coulter's Ridge Hotel, a generous name for what was really just a boarding house with 6 rooms above the restaurant. He paid for a room, climbed the narrow stairs, and set the trunk on the small table by the window. For a long moment, he just looked at it. The leather was cracked with age, the metal fittings tarnished, but still solid. Whatever this trunk held, it had survived decades. It deserved to be opened with respect. Mason sat down on the bed and lifted the lid once more. The quilt came out first. He unfolded it carefully, noting the precise stitches, the way the pattern was designed to tell a story. There were houses stitched in one corner, mountains in another, and in the center a tree with deep roots spreading beneath it. It was the kind of quilt a mother might make for a child, each stitch a prayer for safety and love. He set it aside and picked up the journal. The leather cover was soft with age, the pages inside filled with neat, careful handwriting in faded ink. Mason opened to the first page and began to read. January 15th, 1879. My name is Catherine Rose Blackwood, and I am writing this so that someone, someday, might understand what happened to me and why I made the choices I did. If you are reading this, then perhaps enough time has passed that the truth can finally be known without causing further harm. Mason's hands tightened on the book. Catherine Rose Blackwood. Clara's maiden name had been Blackwood. This was family, his family, Sarah's family. He read on, the words drawing him into a world that existed long before he was born. Catherine wrote of growing up in a settlement near Coulter's Ridge, the youngest daughter of a strict father who believed women should be seen and not heard. She wrote of long days helping her mother with endless chores, of stolen moments reading books when she could, of dreams that seemed impossible for a girl in her position. And she wrote of falling in love with a man her father forbade her to see, a half-Blackfeet trapper named Thomas Running Bear. Mason read, faster, the words painting pictures in his mind. Catherine's father had promised her to a wealthy mine owner, a man 30 years her senior, who wanted a young wife to bear his children. Catherine had refused. The mine owner, she wrote, was known to be cruel to his workers and had buried 2 previous wives under suspicious circumstances. I would rather die free than live as his prisoner, she'd written. Thomas has promised to take me away, far from here where father cannot find us. We will start a new life in the territories, where no one knows our names or cares about old prejudices. I am frightened, but I am also hopeful. For the first time, I can imagine a future that belongs to me. The entries continued, documenting their plans to elope, the supplies they gathered in secret, the route they would take through the mountains. And then came the entry that made Mason's breath catch. February 3rd, 1879. We leave tomorrow at dawn. I have told no one except my sister Mary, who has promised to keep our secret. I carry with me only what I can fit in a small trunk, my mother's quilt, this journal, and the locket Mary gave me with her own likeness inside, so I will never forget her face. Thomas says the journey will be hard, but we are both strong. I pray that someday, when enough time has passed, I might be able to write to Mary and let her know I am safe and happy. Until then, she will have to wonder, and for that I am truly sorry. But I cannot stay. I cannot marry that man. I would rather take my chances with the mountains than surrender my life to his control. Mason turned the page, expecting more entries, but there were none. The rest of the journal was blank, as if Catherine had never had the chance to write another word. He sat very still, the journal heavy in his hands. A woman running away to freedom, disappearing into the mountains with her love, never to be heard from again. And now, 70 years later, her trunk turns up in an abandoned stagecoach, with no explanation. What had happened to Catherine Rose Blackwood? Had she and Thomas made it to safety? Had they built the life they dreamed of? Or had something terrible happened in those mountains, something that left her belongings frozen in time? And why did the locket contain Mary's picture, not Catherine's own likeness? Mason opened the locket again, studying the face. Mary Blackwood, Catherine's sister, Sarah's great-great-grandmother. The resemblance was unmistakable now that he knew who he was looking at. Sarah had inherited those eyes, that jawline, that particular way of holding herself. Mason felt something cold settle in his stomach. Clara had never talked much about her grandmother's family, but he remembered one conversation late at night after Sarah was born. Clara had been holding their newborn daughter, looking down at her with such love it hurt to see. "She has my grandmother Mary's eyes," Clara had whispered. "My mother always said Mary lived with a terrible sadness her whole life, a sister who vanished when Mary was just 18. They never found out what happened to her." Mason closed the journal and placed it carefully back in the trunk. The pieces were starting to come together, but they formed a picture he didn't fully understand yet. Catherine had run away with Thomas and disappeared. Her sister Mary had lived with that loss her entire life. And somehow that grief had echoed down through the generations, touching Clara, touching Sarah. Was that why Sarah had left? Was there something in the blood, some inherited restlessness or need to escape, that had driven both women to vanish? The thought made Mason's chest tight. He'd spent 8 years angry at Sarah for leaving, hurt by her silence, unable to comprehend how she could abandon them without explanation. But what if she'd felt she had no choice? What if she'd been running from something, the way Catherine had run from a forced marriage? Mason stood and walked to the window. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, soft and steady. People moved through the streets below, going about their evening business, unaware that in this small room a man was piecing together a mystery that stretched across decades. He needed to talk to Agnes Fairchild. She would have known Mary Blackwood, might even remember the stories about Catherine's disappearance. And more than that, he needed to find out what had happened to that stagecoach. Where had it been all these years? Why had it appeared now, as if waiting for him specifically to find it? Mason picked up the locket one more time, looking at Mary's face. "Your sister tried to find freedom," he said softly to the image. "I don't know if she succeeded, but I'm going to find out, and maybe, if I'm lucky, I'll understand my own daughter better in the process." He placed the locket back in the trunk and closed the lid. Tomorrow morning, he would visit Agnes Fairchild. Tonight, he would let the story settle in his mind, let it show him what he needed to see. Because for the first time in 3 years, Mason Teller had a purpose that extended beyond simple survival. He had a mystery to solve, a history to uncover, and maybe, just maybe, a way to understand the daughter he'd lost. Morning came cold and clear. Mason woke early, as he always did, and spent a few minutes standing at the window, watching the town come to life below. Shopkeepers swept snow from their doorsteps, a milk wagon rattled down the street, smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals, ordinary life continuing as it always had. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. The trunk sat on the table where he'd left it, a silent reminder that the past was never as far away as people liked to think. After a quick breakfast of coffee and eggs at the restaurant downstairs, Mason asked the proprietor for directions to Maple Street. The blue house at the end wasn't hard to find, a small, well-maintained cottage with lace curtains in the windows and a garden that probably bloomed beautifully in summer. Now it was buried under snow, but Mason could see the care that had gone into planning it. He knocked on the door, hat in hand, suddenly uncertain. What was he going to say? That he'd found a trunk in a mysterious stagecoach and wanted to know about a woman who'd been dead for decades. It sounded foolish, even in his own mind. The door opened to reveal a tiny woman with white hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and bright, taking in Mason with one swift, assessing glance. "Agnes Fairchild?" he asked. "I am. And you're Mason Teller. I remember you. You married Clara Blackwood about 30 years back." Her voice was surprisingly strong. "Haven't seen you in town much since she passed. My condolences. Clara was a good woman." "Thank you, ma'am. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time. Jakob Hansen said you might be able to help me with something." Agnes studied him for another moment, then stepped back. "Come in, then. It's too cold to stand in the doorway." The interior of the cottage was warm and cozy, filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that accumulated over a long life. Photographs covered every surface, books lined the shelves, and a fat orange cat dozed on the sofa by the fireplace. "Sit," Agnes said, gesturing to a chair. "Would you like tea?" "No, thank you. I don't want to take up too much of your time." "Time is one thing I have plenty of." She settled into her own chair with a slight wince that spoke of arthritic joints. "Now, what brings you to my door after all these years?" Mason leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I found something yesterday. An old stagecoach out in the valley, abandoned with no tracks around it. Inside was a trunk belonging to Catherine Rose Blackwood. She would have been Clara's great-great-aunt, if I have the family tree right." Agnes's expression changed immediately, surprise followed quickly by something that looked like recognition. "Catherine," she said softly. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in a very long time. You knew her?" "Knew of her. I was just a girl when the story made its rounds, but it was the kind of tale people repeated, a scandalous romance, a disappearance, a family torn apart. Those things stick in memory." Agnes folded her hands in her lap. "What exactly did you find in this trunk?" Mason told her about the journal, the quilt, the locket with Mary's picture. As he spoke, Agnes nodded slowly, as if each detail confirmed something she already suspected. Mary Blackwood lived her whole life wondering what happened to her sister. Agnes said, when Mason finished, she married, had children, grew old, but that loss never left her. I remember her in her final years. She'd be sitting on her porch, and sometimes she'd just stare at the mountains as if she expected Catherine to come walking out of them. The journal says Catherine was running away with a man named Thomas Running Bear. Her father wanted her to marry someone else. Jeremiah Blackwood. Agnes's mouth tightened. A hard man, by all accounts. Thought he knew what was best for everyone, especially his daughters. Catherine was his youngest and the most spirited. When she refused the match he'd arranged, he locked her in her room. But she got out somehow, and she ran. With Thomas. Yes, people said he was a good man, honest and kind, but Jeremiah couldn't see past his heritage. The prejudice ran deep in those days, still does, in some quarters. Thomas had offered to speak to Jeremiah man to man, to ask for Catherine's hand properly. Jeremiah threw him off the property. Agnes paused, her gaze distant. They say Jeremiah organized a search party when he discovered Catherine was gone. Spent weeks combing the mountains, convinced that Thomas had taken his daughter by force. He couldn't conceive that she'd left willingly. When they found no trace, he declared her dead, and forbade anyone in the family from speaking her name again. But Mary spoke it. Mary kept her sister's memory alive, yes, much to her father's displeasure. Agnes reached for a photograph on the side table, a faded image of a young woman who looked remarkably like the picture in the locket. This was Mary at 20. "You can see the resemblance to your Sarah, I imagine." Mason took the photograph with careful hands. The resemblance was striking. Sarah had this woman's eyes, her bone structure, even something about the way she held herself. Clara said Mary lived with sadness. The sadness of not knowing. That's the cruelest kind. Agnes's voice was gentle. When someone dies, you grieve and eventually find a way to move forward. But when someone simply disappears, you're trapped in that moment, forever. Part of you is always waiting, always hoping they'll come back and explain. The words hit Mason harder than he'd expected. Wasn't that exactly how he'd felt for the past 8 years? Trapped in the moment Sarah left, always waiting for her to return, to explain, to give him some way to understand. "Do you think Catherine made it?" he asked. "Do you think she and Thomas found their freedom?" Agnes was quiet for a long moment. "I'd like to think so. I'd like to believe that two young people who loved each other enough to risk everything found a way to build a life together. But the truth is, I don't know. No one does. They vanished as completely as if the mountains had swallowed them whole, and now the trunk appears," Mason said. "After 70 years. Yes, that is peculiar, isn't it?" Agnes tilted her head, studying him. "May I ask why this matters so much to you?" "I can see it does, but I'm curious about your reasons." Mason hesitated, then decided honesty was owed. "My daughter left 8 years ago. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. Clara asked me on her deathbed to find Sarah, to bring her home. I promised I would, but I have no idea where to start. When I found that trunk, when I saw Mary's picture and realized how much Sarah looks like her, I thought maybe if I understood why Catherine ran, it might help me understand why Sarah did." Agnes's expression softened. "You think it's inherited? This need to escape? I don't know what to think. But it's the first thread I've found, and I'm not letting go of it." "Then I'll tell you what I know," Agnes said. "Mary kept records, letters, newspaper clippings. anything related to Catherine's disappearance. When she died, her daughter, your Clara's grandmother, inherited them. I believe they were passed down to Clara's mother, and then to Clara herself. If Clara kept them, they'd be among her things. Mason felt something shift in his chest. I haven't gone through Clara's trunk. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to do it. It's still in the cabin, exactly where she left it. Perhaps it's time, Agnes said gently. Sometimes the answers we need are closer than we think. And Mason, whatever you find, whatever you learn about Catherine or Mary or your own daughter, remember this: people run for different reasons. Sometimes it's away from something, sometimes it's towards something. The running itself isn't what matters. It's what they're seeking that tells you who they are. Mason stood, the photograph of Mary still in his hand. May I borrow this? I'd like to compare it to the locket picture. Keep it, I have others. Agnes rose more slowly, using the arm of her chair for support. Come back and tell me what you discover. I find I'm invested in this mystery now. At the door, Mason paused. Thank you for sharing what you knew. It helps more than you might think. We all need our mysteries solved eventually, Agnes replied. Even the ones we've been living with so long, we've forgotten they were mysteries at all. Mason walked back through town toward the livery, his mind churning. Clara's trunk. He'd avoided it for 3 years, unable to face the memories it would contain. But if Agnes was right, if Clara had kept Mary's records about Catherine, then those memories might hold the key to everything. He collected copper and began the journey home with a renewed sense of purpose. The trunk from the stagecoach was still secured to the panniers, but now it felt less like a random discovery and more like a deliberate message across time. Catherine had left her story behind, perhaps hoping someone would find it and understand. Now Mason just had to find out what happened to her, and in doing so, maybe he'd finally understand what had happened to his own daughter. The ride home took longer than usual. The snow had started falling again, and Mason found himself stopping frequently, not because of the weather, but because his mind was elsewhere. Every few miles, he'd pause and just stand there with Copper, looking out at the white expanse of the valley, thinking about Catherine and Thomas, about Mary waiting her, whole life for news that never came, about Sarah somewhere out in the world, living a life he knew nothing about. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk was settling over the mountains, turning the snow purple in the fading light. Mason got Copper settled in the lean-to with feed and water, then carried both trunks inside. He set Catherine's on the table and Clara's, which had been stored in the corner of the bedroom for 3 years, beside it. For a long while, he just looked at them. 2 trunks, 2 women, 2 mysteries separated by decades but somehow connected. He built up the fire until the cabin was warm, made coffee that he didn't drink, and finally sat down in front of Clara's trunk with his hands resting on the lid. This was harder than finding a stranger's belongings in an abandoned coach. This was Clara's life, her private things, the pieces of herself she'd kept close. Opening it felt like an intrusion, even though she was gone, especially because she was gone. "I'm sorry," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear him. "I should have done this sooner." The trunk opened with a familiar creak. He'd made it for Clara as a wedding gift, carved her initials into the lid, fitted it with good brass hinges that had lasted 30 years. Inside, the smell of lavender sachets rose up, and Mason had to close his eyes for a moment against the wave of memory. Clara had always loved lavender. The top layer was clothes, her good Sunday dress, the shawl she'd worn in winter, a pair of soft gloves. Mason touched them gently, then set them aside. Beneath the clothes were letters tied with ribbon, photographs in frames wrapped in cloth, and a leather portfolio that looked very old. He opened the portfolio first. Inside were newspaper clippings, their edges yellowed and brittle. The dates ranged from February 1879 to March 1880. And each one related to the same story, the disappearance of Catherine Rose Blackwood and Thomas Running Bear. Local woman. Missing. Read one headline. "Search continues for Blackwood girl," said another. Mason read them carefully, noting how the tone changed over time. The early articles treated it as a tragedy, a young woman lost in the mountains. Later articles became more speculative, with one even suggesting that Thomas had kidnapped Catherine for ransom, a theory Jeremiah Blackwood apparently endorsed. But there were other clippings too, carefully preserved. Small notices from newspapers in distant territories, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. Couple seeks work, read one. Homestead established, said another. Someone had circled certain names and dates in faded pencil. Mary's handwriting, Mason guessed. She'd been looking for any sign of her sister, any hint that Catherine had survived. Beneath the clippings was a letter, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn thin. Mason opened it with extreme care. "My dearest Mary," it began. The handwriting matched the journal he'd found in the stagecoach. Catherine's writing. "If you are reading this, then I have succeeded in sending word to you without farther discovering. I pray this letter finds you well and that you have not worried too much. Thomas and I are safe. We made it through the mountains, though the journey was harder than we anticipated. We are living in a small settlement in Montana Territory now, far enough from Coulter's Ridge that Father's influence cannot reach us. I cannot tell you exactly where we are. It is safer for you not to know. Father would force the information from you if he suspected you had it, but I wanted you to understand that I am happy, truly happy, in a way I never was at home. Thomas is good to me. We have a small house, a garden, and hopes for the future. We plan to have children when we are more established. I think of you every day and miss you terribly. I have enclosed something for you to keep. When you hold it, remember that I chose this life freely and that I have no regrets. Perhaps someday, when enough years have passed and Father's anger has cooled, we can see each other again. Until then, know that you are in my heart always. Your loving sister, Catherine." The letter was dated May 1879, 3 months after Catherine's disappearance. Mason stared at it, his mind racing. Catherine had survived the journey. She'd made it to safety, built a life with Thomas, been happy. So why had her trunk ended up in an abandoned stagecoach in the valley? He looked through the rest of the portfolio, but there were no more letters from Catherine, only Mary's notes, written in a shaky hand much later in life. "I received Catherine's letter in June of 1879, Mary had written. "It was the happiest day of my life, knowing she was safe. I wrote back immediately, care of the general store in Malta, Montana, as she instructed. I never received another reply. For months I checked the mail every day, hoping. Then a year passed, then 2. I wrote again and again, but my letters were never answered. I do not know if she received them or if something prevented her from writing back. I do not know if she is still alive. This not knowing is a torment I will carry to my grave." Mason set down the notes and rubbed his face with both hands. So Mary had heard from Catherine once, just once, long enough to know her sister had survived. But then the silence had returned, deeper and more permanent than before. What had happened? Had Catherine and Thomas moved on? Had they decided to cut all ties with the past completely? Or had something gone wrong? He thought about the stagecoach again, appearing out of nowhere with Catherine's trunk inside. An image formed in his mind, Catherine and Thomas, travelling, perhaps returning to visit Mary in secret. Something happening on the journey. The coach abandoned in a hurry, the trunk left behind because there wasn't time to retrieve it, or because retrieving it would have been too dangerous. But that didn't explain the lack of tracks or why the coach had only been discovered now, 70 years later. Mason stood and paced the small cabin, trying to work through the logic. The mountains sometimes gave up their secrets, slowly. Avalanches could bury things for decades. Spring thaws could reveal what winter had hidden. Maybe the coach had been covered by snow and rock, preserved in a kind of frozen time capsule, and only recently had weather conditions exposed it again. It was possible, not likely maybe, but possible. He turned his attention back to Clara's trunk. There were still more items inside a small wooden box that clinked when he picked it up. Mason opened it to find a collection of buttons, the kind people saved from worn-out clothes. But tucked among the buttons was something that made his heart stop. A letter addressed to Clara in handwriting he recognized immediately, Sarah's handwriting. The envelope was sealed, the address written in Sarah's careful script, but it had never been mailed. Clara must have found it after Sarah left, hidden somewhere in their daughter's room. The postmark space was blank. Sarah had written it but never sent it. Mason's hands shook as he picked up the envelope. This was it. This was Sarah's explanation, the words she'd meant to say but hadn't. For 8 years he'd wanted to know why she'd left. The answer was right here in his hands. But suddenly, he wasn't sure he was ready to read it. What if the reason was something he'd done? What if Sarah had left because of him, because he'd failed her somehow? What if the truth was worse than not knowing? He sat down heavily in the chair, the letter in his lap. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The fire crackled, copper stamped in the lean-to. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening, but nothing about this moment felt ordinary. Mason looked from the letter to Catherine's journal, still sitting on the table where he'd left it. 2 women who'd run from their lives, 2 families left behind to wonder and grieve. History repeating itself across generations. But Catherine had been running toward something, toward love and freedom and a life of her own choosing. What had Sarah been running toward? Or had she been running away from something instead? There was only one way to find out. Mason broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out the pages inside. His daughter's words waited to be read, and this time, he wasn't going to put it off. Whatever Sarah had written, whatever truth she'd tried to tell, he owed it to Clara's memory and to his own peace of mind to finally understand. He unfolded the letter, took a deep breath, and began to read. "Dear Mom and Dad," the letter began. Just those 4 words, and Mason could hear Sarah's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "I know you'll be confused and hurt when you find this, and I'm sorry for that. I've written this letter a dozen times, trying to find the right words, but there are no right words for what I need to say, so I'll just say it plainly. I'm leaving because I have to, not because I want to. There's something inside me that I can't explain, something that's been growing stronger for as long as I can remember. It's like a pull, a need to move, to search, to find something I don't even have a name for. When I was little, I could ignore it, but as I got older, it became harder. It's not that I don't love you both, I do, more than I can say. It's not that I'm unhappy at home, you gave me everything a daughter could want. But it's not enough, and I hate myself for feeling that way. Mom, you told me once about your grandmother Mary, how she used to stare at the mountains like she was waiting for someone. I understood that feeling even then, though I didn't know how to explain it. I'm not waiting for someone to come back. I'm waiting for myself to go, if that makes any sense. Every day I stay feels like I'm losing a piece of who I'm supposed to be. Dad, I know this will hurt you the most. You've always been steady, reliable, rooted in this place like the mountains themselves. I love that about you, but I'm not built that way. I'm more like wind. I think I need to move or I'll die. I'm not running from anything. I'm running towards something, though I don't know what it is yet. Maybe it's a place, maybe it's a purpose, maybe it's just understanding who I really am when I'm not defined by being someone's daughter or someone's friend or someone from Coulter's Ridge. I know you'll want to find me, but please don't. I need to do this alone. I need to know I can survive on my own, make my own choices, my own mistakes. If I know you're out there looking for me, I'll never be free of the feeling that I owe you an explanation for every decision I make. Maybe someday, when I've found what I'm looking for, I'll come back. Or maybe I'll write and tell you where I am, what I've discovered. But for now, I need silence and distance and the space to become whoever I'm meant to be. I love you both. Please forgive me. Please understand that this isn't about you failing me. You didn't fail. You gave me roots, and that's beautiful, but I also need wings. Sarah. Mason read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing something new. The first time, all he could feel was the pain of her leaving. The second time, he heard the desperation in her words, the struggle to explain something she barely understood herself. The third time, he finally heard what she was really saying, that the leaving wasn't rejection, but necessity, not an escape from love, but a search for self. He set the letter down and stared at the fire for a long time. Outside, night had fully fallen. The wind had died down, leaving everything still and quiet. Sarah had been running towards something, just like Catherine. Both women pulled by forces they couldn't resist, needs they couldn't deny. And both had left family behind to wonder and grieve and try to understand. But there was a difference. Catherine had known what she was running toward: a specific person, a specific life. Sarah was searching for something she couldn't even name. That made it harder somehow. How could you find someone when they didn't know where they were going? Mason picked up Catherine's journal again and paged through it slowly. Her words were so full of certainty, of conviction, that leaving was the right choice. Sarah's letter, by contrast, was full of doubt and apology and hope that someday her parents would understand. He thought about Mary, spending her whole life watching the mountains. Agnes had called it the cruelty of not knowing. But maybe there was something else, something neither Mary nor Mason had understood until now. Maybe the watching wasn't about hoping the lost person would return. Maybe it was about sending love across the distance, trusting that wherever they were, they could feel it. Mason stood and went to the window. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky, unchanged and unchanging. Somewhere out there, Sarah was living a life he knew nothing about. Was she happy? Had she found what she was looking for? Or was she still searching, still pulled by that nameless need? He realized, with a kind of quiet revelation, that he might never know. She'd asked him not to look for her, and maybe the kindest thing he could do was honor that request. Not because he didn't love her, but because he did. But that didn't mean giving up entirely. There was still the mystery of Catherine to solve, still the question of what had happened to her after that single letter to Mary. If Mason could piece together Catherine's story, complete the narrative that Mary had spent her life trying to understand, maybe that would be enough. Maybe knowing how one story ended would help him make peace with the story that was still unfolding. He turned back to the trunks. Catherine's belongings were laid out on the pruted table, the quilt, the journal, the locket. Mary's research was scattered across the bed, newspapers, notes, the precious single letter from her sister. Together, they told the beginning and middle of a story. What Mason needed now was the end. Tomorrow, he would go back to the stagecoach. He'd examine it more carefully, look for clues he might have missed in his initial shock at finding it. There had to be something, a name, a date, some indication of where it had come from or where it had been going. And he needed to find out if there were any records in Coulter's Ridge about stagecoach routes from the 1872nd. Jacob Hansen might know, or the Historical Society if the town had one. Someone had to remember the old routes, the stops, the schedules. Mason gathered up the letters and clippings, placing them carefully back in the portfolio. He folded Sarah's letter and put it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Then he sat down at the table and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. If Sarah had written to her parents, even if she'd never sent the letter, then maybe Mason could do the same. Maybe he could write to her, put into words what he'd never been able to say in person. Not with the expectation that she'd ever read it, but just to clarify his own thoughts, to work through his feelings in a way that felt constructive rather than destructive. "Dear Sarah," he wrote. The pencil felt awkward in his calloused hands, but he pressed on. "I found your letter today. It was in your mother's trunk, which I finally opened 3 years after her death. I wish I'd found it sooner. I wish a lot of things. I want you to know that I understand now, or at least I'm trying to. You needed to leave, and I needed to let you go. Those two things seemed impossible to reconcile, but maybe they're not. Maybe love means accepting that the people we care about have their own paths to walk, even when those paths lead away from us. Your mother asked me on her deathbed to find you and bring you home. I promised I would, but I think I misunderstood what she meant. She didn't want me to hunt you down or drag you back against your will. She wanted me to find a way to understand you, to bridge the distance between us with comprehension instead of anger. I'm working on that now. I've discovered something about our family history that I think you'd find fascinating. Your great-great-great-aunt, Catherine, ran away in 1879 to marry the man she loved. She sent one letter to her sister Mary, then disappeared from the family's knowledge. I found Catherine's trunk yesterday in an abandoned stagecoach, and it's led me on a search for answers. I don't know how Catherine's story ends yet, but I'm going to find out, and when I do, I'll think of you and hope that whatever you're searching for, you find it. I'll hope that your story has a happy ending, even if I'm not there to see it. I love you, Sarah. I always will. Your dad. Mason set down the pencil and read over what he'd written. It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest. That would have to be enough. He folded the letter and put it in an envelope, but he didn't address it. There was nowhere to send it. Instead, he placed it in Catherine's trunk alongside her journal and quilt. 2 letters now, 2 attempts across generations to explain the inexplicable need to leave. Maybe someday, somehow, Sarah would read it. Maybe she wouldn't, but it existed, and that meant something. It meant Mason had tried to understand, had made the effort to reach across the silence and say the things that mattered. For now, that was all he could do. Mason woke the next morning with purpose humming through his veins. The night's reflection had brought clarity, and with it, determination. He needed to return to the stagecoach, needed to examine it with fresh eyes and the knowledge he now possessed about Catherine's story. After tending to Copper and eating a quick breakfast, he packed supplies for the day: rope, a lantern, tools that might be useful for examining the coach more thoroughly. The sky was overcast but not threatening, and the temperature had risen just enough to make travel manageable. The ride to the valley took just over 2 hours. Mason found himself studying the landscape differently now, imagining Catherine and Thomas making this same journey in winter, fleeing toward an uncertain future. The mountains that had always seemed familiar suddenly felt like they held secrets in every shadow. When he reached the spot where the trail passed closest to the stagecoach's location, Mason dismounted and led Copper through the deep snow. The coach sat exactly as he'd left it, half buried and mysterious, a relic from another time. In the daylight, with his mind focused on investigation rather than shock, Mason could see details he'd missed before. The wood was old but well-maintained. This had been a quality coach in its day. The paint, mostly worn away now, had once been dark green with gold trim. The wheels, though frozen in place, showed signs of recent repair work, not 70 years recent, but perhaps 20 or 30 years ago. Someone had been using this coach long after stagecoach travel had fallen out of fashion. Mason circled it slowly, examining every detail. The driver's bench was secured with iron brackets that showed little rust despite the decades. The doors hung straight on their hinges. Even the leather straps that held luggage in place were intact, just stiff with age and cold. This coach hadn't been abandoned due to breakdown or accident. It had been deliberately left here, positioned with care. The question was, why, and by whom? Mason opened the door again and climbed inside, this time with his lantern lit. The interior was small, designed to hold 4 passengers comfortably, 6 if necessary. The seats were upholstered in faded velvet, and the floor, he stopped, his lantern illuminating something he'd missed the first time. Scratches in the wooden floor, deliberate marks carved with a knife or sharp tool. Mason knelt down, holding the lantern close, and traced the marks with his finger. They formed letters. A message carved into the floor, hidden beneath where the trunk had sat. Mason's heart beat faster as he made out the words, "For Mary, with love." The rest of the story. See, the rest of the story. Catherine had left this coach here intentionally with her trunk inside, as a message to her sister. But why here? Why this specific spot in the middle of nowhere? Mason sat back on his heels, thinking. Mary had lived in Coulter's Ridge her whole life. This valley was on the route between the town and the mountain passes that led to Montana Territory. If Catherine had been traveling this way, returning to visit Mary, perhaps this would have been the natural route. He climbed out of the coach and began examining the ground around it more carefully. The snow was deep, but underneath he could feel something, not rock or frozen earth, but wood. Mason retrieved a shovel from Copper's pack and began carefully clearing snow away from the coach's wheels. After 30 minutes of work, he understood. The coach wasn't just sitting on the ground. It was resting on a wooden platform, deliberately constructed and positioned. Someone had built a stage here, a flat surface that would keep the coach level and prevent it from sinking into soft earth. This wasn't a random abandonment. This was a monument. Someone had placed this coach here as a memorial, a marker, a way of preserving Catherine's story in a location that meant something. Mason stood back, surveying his discovery. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed raised more questions than it answered. Catherine had survived her initial escape, had written to Mary from Montana. But at some point years later, judging by the condition of the coach, she'd returned to this valley. She'd brought her trunk, her precious belongings, and left them here with a message. Had she died on this spot? Had something happened that prevented her from reaching Mary? Or had this been her way of telling a story she couldn't tell in person? Mason walked a wider circle around the coach, looking for any other signs of disturbance or meaning. About 50 feet away, he found it a small pile of rocks, carefully stacked, the kind of cairn people built to mark a grave or significant spot. The rocks were covered in snow, but when Mason cleared them, he found words carved into the flattest stone. Thomas Running Bear, born 1851, died 1904, beloved husband. Free man, Mason's breath caught. Thomas had died here, or at least was memorialized here, 53 years old when he passed. That would have been 25 years after he and Catherine had run away together. They'd had a quarter-century together, a lifetime really, a good long run at happiness. But where was Catherine's cairn? Mason searched the bow area thoroughly, checking every likely spot, but found nothing. No second grave, no marker, no indication that Catherine had died here alongside her husband. Perhaps she'd survived him. Perhaps she'd built this memorial to Thomas, left her trunk as a message to Mary, and then what? Continued on? Returned to Montana? Lived out her remaining years somewhere else? Mason returned to the coach and retrieved Catherine's journal, reading through it again with new understanding. The entries were from 1879, when she and Thomas had first run away. But the journal itself was in good condition, not the worn and battered state it should have been if she'd carried it through 25 years of hard frontier living. She'd kept it safe, preserved it deliberately, knowing it was part of the story she wanted to tell. Mason climbed back into the coach and examined every inch of it by lantern light. Under the seat, he found something he'd missed before, a small leather pouch wedged into the corner. He pulled it out carefully and opened it. Inside were papers, legal documents, by the look of them. Mason spread them out on the seat and read by the flickering lantern light. A marriage certificate from a circuit judge in Montana Territory, dated August 1879. Thomas Running Bear and Catherine Rose Blackwood, legally wed. A land grant document showing they'd established a homestead in 1880. A birth certificate. Mason's hands trembled as he read it, for a daughter named Mary Catherine Running Bear, born 1881. They'd had a child, a daughter they'd named after Catherine's sister. Mary had a niece she'd never known about, never met. There were more documents. A bill of sale for the stagecoach, dated 1903, showing Thomas had purchased it for transport and family business. A letter from a doctor, dated 1904, confirming Thomas Running Bear's death from pneumonia. And finally, a will, written in Thomas's hand, leaving everything to "my beloved wife Catherine and our daughter, Mary Catherine." Mason sat in the dim coach, surrounded by the pieces of a life he was only now beginning to understand. Catherine and Thomas had made it. They'd built a life together, had a child, established a home. They'd been happy for 25 years. But Thomas had died, and Catherine had been left alone with a daughter. A daughter who would have been 23 years old in 1904, the same age Sarah had been when she left home. The parallels made Mason's skin prickle. Catherine's daughter, also named Mary, living on a frontier homestead with her widowed mother. What had become of her? Had she stayed with Catherine, or had she left to find her own path? Mason carefully folded the documents and placed them back in the pouch. He was getting closer to understanding the full story, but there were still gaps. Why had Catherine brought the coach here to this spot? When had she done it? And what had happened to her after Thomas died? He needed more information, the kind of information that might only exist in official records, census data, property records, maybe even newspaper archives from Montana Territory towns. Mason climbed out of the coach and stood in the snow, looking at Thomas's cairn. "You had 25 good years together," he said aloud. "That's more than a lot of people get. You did right by her. I hope someone told you that before you died." The wind picked up, carrying snow devils across the valley floor. Mason felt the cold seeping through his coat and realized he'd been at the site for hours. The light was already beginning to fade. Winter days were short this far north. He took one last look around, committing every detail to memory, then headed back to where Copper waited patiently. Tomorrow, he would make another trip to town. He needed to send telegrams to Montana to search for records that might tell him what happened to Catherine and her daughter after 1904. The story wasn't over yet. Mason was more certain of that than ever. Catherine had left this elaborate memorial not just to honor Thomas, but to communicate something important. The phrase kept echoing in his mind, the rest of the story. There was more to discover, and Mason wouldn't rest until he found it. Mason spent 3 days in town, sending telegrams and waiting for responses. He took a room again at the boarding house, visited Agnes Fairchild to update her on his discoveries, and spent long hours in the town clerk's office searching through whatever records were available. Agnes had been particularly interested in the discovery of Thomas's grave and the documents about Catherine's daughter. "So, Catherine named her child after her sister," she'd said thoughtfully. "That's both beautiful and heartbreaking. Mary would have treasured knowing that if she'd ever found out. But Mary never had found out. She died in 1942, still believing her sister had disappeared without a trace into the mountains. The single letter had been her only comfort, and even that had eventually faded into uncertainty. On the 3rd day, Mason received a reply to one of his telegrams. It was from a clerk at the county records office in Malta, Montana, and it contained information that made Mason read the message 3 times to be sure he understood it correctly. Records show Catherine R. Running Bear, widow, resided Malta area 1904 to 1919. Property transferred 1919 to daughter Mary C. Running Bear upon Catherine's departure. Census records show Mary Catherine Running Bear married 1905 to John Wesley Pritchard. Couple had 3 children. Family remained Malta area through 1930 census. Trail goes cold after that. Hope this helps. Mason stared at the telegram. Catherine had lived until at least 1940 years after she'd run away from Coulter's Ridge. She'd raised her daughter, seen her married, become a grandmother, and then, at age 60, she'd departed. The word choice was specific, not died, but departed, meaning she'd left Malta, gone somewhere else. But where and why? Mason paid for another telegram, this time asking for any records of where Catherine might have gone in 1919. Then he returned to the boarding house and pulled out all the documents again, spreading them across the small table in his room. Catherine's journal ended in 1879. The documents from the coach showed a life built in Montana through 1904. Now he knew she'd lived at least until 1919, possibly longer. But there was a gap. Where had she gone when she departed Malta? The answer came the next morning, delivered by the same young clerk who'd brought the previous telegram. But this time, the message was longer, more detailed, and it changed everything. Additional research per your request. Found notation in Malta church records, Catherine R. Running Bear left Montana Territory 1919 to return home and make peace. Pastor's diary mentions she intended to visit estranged family in Idaho Territory before her time ran out. She was ill, consumption mentioned. No record of her arrival anywhere. Last known sighting Malta train station, November 1919. One interesting note, her daughter Mary Catherine accompanied her on journey. Both purchased tickets to Coulter's Ridge. Mason's hands began to shake. Catherine had tried to come home. After 40 years, knowing she was dying, she'd attempted to return to her sister, to make peace with her past. And her daughter had traveled with her. But they'd never arrived in Coulter's Ridge. Mary Blackwood had died in 1942 without ever knowing her sister had tried to come back. What had happened on that journey? Why had they never made it? The stagecoach. Mason's mind raced. The stagecoach in the valley, with Catherine's trunk inside, positioned carefully as a memorial. She'd gotten close, so close, but something had stopped her. Weather, perhaps. It had been November, the start of winter, or her illness had worsened, making travel impossible. Mason grabbed his coat and headed out into the cold morning. He needed to talk to Agnes again, needed to think this through with someone who understood the history. But when he reached Agnes's blue cottage, he found her in her front room with a visitor, a woman in her 60s, well-dressed, with a kind face and eyes that looked familiar. Mason stopped in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. Come in, Agnes said, waving him forward. Mason, tell her, I'd like you to meet someone who arrived in town this morning looking for me. This is Elizabeth Pritchard. She's visiting from Seattle. The name hit Mason like a physical blow. Pritchard. Mary Catherine Running Bear had married John Wesley Pritchard. The woman stood, extending her hand. Mr. Teller, Agnes has been telling me about your investigation into our family history. I'm Catherine Running Bear's great-granddaughter. Mason shook her hand numbly, his mind struggling to process this coincidence. What brings you to Coulter's Ridge? Elizabeth smiled, though there was sadness in it. The same thing that brings you to your investigations, I suspect, questions about the past. My grandmother, Mary Catherine, died when I was young, but before she passed, she told me a story that always haunted me. She said her mother Catherine had tried to return to Idaho in 1919 to reconcile with family before she died, but they never made it. Something happened on the journey. What happened? Mason asked, his voice rough. They were traveling by train, but had to take a stagecoach for the final leg. The rail line didn't reach all the way to Coulter's Ridge back then. It was November, and a terrible storm came through. The coach got stuck in the valley. My grandmother said her mother was too weak to continue, too sick from the consumption. She knew she was dying. Elizabeth pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, though her eyes stayed dry. Catherine told my grandmother to continue on alone to find Catherine's sister Mary and deliver a message. But Mary Catherine refused to leave her mother. They stayed with the coach, in that valley, through the storm. Catherine died there, in her daughter's arms, still miles from home. The room was utterly silent. Mason felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. My grandmother buried her mother right there, Elizabeth continued. She didn't know what else to do. She was 23 years old, alone in a snowstorm with her mother's body. She placed her mother's most precious belongings in the trunk, left it in the coach as a kind of memorial, and then she walked. She walked through the storm to Coulter's Ridge, determined to complete her mother's mission. But she never delivered the message, Agnes said softly. We would have heard, Elizabeth nodded. When she finally reached town, half-frozen and delirious, she learned that Mary Blackwood, her aunt, though they'd never met, had died 6 months earlier. Catherine's sister had passed away in May of 1919, just months before Catherine had started her journey home. My grandmother said the timing broke something in her. She'd failed her mother's final wish. She couldn't complete the reconciliation Catherine had traveled so far to make. Mason found his voice. What did she do? She left, walked out of Coulter's Ridge the same day she arrived and never came back. She returned to Montana, married soon after, and rarely spoke of what happened. but the story haunted her. She made me promise that someday, when I was old enough and had the time, I would come here and try to find that valley, that coach, that memorial. She wanted someone to know what Catherine had tried to do. Elizabeth pulled an envelope from her bag. She left me this. It's the message Catherine wanted delivered to Mary. My grandmother carried it her whole life, never opening it, preserving it for a moment that never came. She handed the envelope to Mason. It was sealed with wax, the paper yellowed but intact. Mason stared at it. This message across time, this attempt at healing that had arrived 40 years too late. "Why give it to me?" he asked. "Because Agnes tells me you found the coach. You found Catherine's memorial. You're asking the same questions my grandmother asked her whole life." Elizabeth's eyes were gentle. "And because Agnes tells me you have a daughter who left home years ago, you understand what it means to send love across distance and silence, hoping it somehow reaches the person it's meant for." Mason looked at Agnes, who nodded encouragingly. "Open it," she said. "Complete what was started. Bear witness to Catherine's words." With hands that shook slightly, Mason broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was shaky. Catherine had been very ill when she wrote this, but still legible. "My dearest Mary, if you are reading this, then I have made it home at last. 40 years is a lifetime to be away, and I am sorry for every day of silence. I want you to know that I thought of you constantly, that you were in my heart, even when I could not reach you with words. I chose to leave, and I do not regret that choice. Thomas and I had a beautiful life together. We had a daughter. I named her Mary Catherine, after you, and she has been the joy of my later years. I only wish you could have known her, could have seen the woman she's become. But I need you to know something important, something I've carried all these years. When I left, I didn't understand what it would cost you. I thought only of my own freedom, my own happiness. I didn't think about the pain my silence would cause, the grief you would carry. I was young and thoughtless, and I am sorry. You deserved better from me. You deserved to know I was safe, to share in my life, to be part of my daughter's childhood. My silence was cruel, even if it wasn't meant that way. I hope you can forgive me. I am dying now, and I wanted to come home one last time to tell you this, in person, to thank you for keeping my memory alive when I gave you nothing to hold on to tell you that the sister you lost is still here, still loving you, still grateful for the years we had together. If I do not survive this journey, please know that my last thoughts are of you, your loving sister, Catherine." Mason's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his eyes. This message, meant to heal a rift 40 years old, had never reached its intended recipient. Both sisters had died without reconciliation, Catherine trying to bridge the gap she'd created, Mary never knowing her sister had tried. But the message existed. It had been preserved, carried, protected, and now, more than 70 years later, someone was finally reading it, finally understanding what Catherine had attempted. Mason looked up at Elizabeth. "Thank you for bringing this, for completing your grandmother's mission. There's more," Elizabeth said quietly. "My grandmother told me that when she returned to Montana, she realized something. The restlessness that had driven her mother to leave at 18, the same restlessness had been in her own blood. She'd felt it her whole life. She'd married to try to settle it, but it never quite went away. She said it was like an inheritance, passed down through the women in our family. A need to move, to search, to find something beyond what was offered." Mason's heart stopped. "An inheritance," he repeated. "She warned me I might feel it too. And I did, though I managed it differently. I became a travel writer, found ways to move without abandoning family. But the pull was always there." Elizabeth looked at Mason with understanding in her eyes. "Agnes mentioned your daughter left home years ago without explanation. I wonder, mister, tell her, if she felt it too, if that restlessness runs in your wife's family, passed down from Catherine through all the women who came after her. Not something to fight or feel guilty about, but something to understand and find healthy expression for." Mason sat down heavily in the nearest chair. The truth of it struck him like lightning. Sarah hadn't left because of something he'd done or failed to do. She'd left because something in her blood, in her bones, in her inherited nature had called her to move. The same thing that had called to Catherine, to Mary Catherine, to Elizabeth. It wasn't rejection. It was inheritance. And understanding that changed everything. The three of them sat in Agnes's front room for hours, talking about family, about loss, about the patterns that repeated across generations. Elizabeth shared what she knew of her grandmother's life. Mary Catherine had been a strong woman, resilient and independent, who'd raised 3 children largely on her own after her husband died young. She'd never returned to Coulter's Ridge, but she'd never forgotten that November storm or her mother's final journey. She used to say, Elizabeth told them, that some stories don't get proper endings in their own time. They have to wait for the right person to come along and finish them properly. Mason felt the weight of those words. He'd found the stagecoach by chance, or what he'd thought was chance. But maybe there was purpose in it. Maybe Catherine's story had been waiting all these years for someone who would understand, someone who needed to understand. "I'd like to see it," Elizabeth said. "The coach, the memorial. Would you show me?" "Tomorrow," Mason agreed. "First light? It's a few hours' ride, and we'll want the full day." That evening, after Elizabeth had settled into the boarding house, Mason remained with Agnes. The old woman made tea and they sat by her fire, the cat purring contentedly between them. "You've changed since you first knocked on my door," Agnes observed. "Less burdened, somehow." "I feel different," Mason admitted. "I've spent 8 years angry at Sarah for leaving, angry at myself for somehow failing her. But it wasn't failure. It wasn't about me at all." That's a hard truth for a parent to accept, that our children's choices aren't always about us. "Clara knew," Mason said. "Or she suspected, at least. She told me once that Sarah was like a wild thing, not meant to be caged. I thought she meant Sarah was difficult or rebellious, but she meant it literally. Sarah needed space to roam, to find herself." Agnes sipped her tea. "What will you do with this understanding?" Mason was quiet for a long time. "I don't know yet. Sarah asked me not to look for her, and I think I need to honor that. But I can do something for Catherine and Mary. I can give their story the ending it deserves." "How?" "Catherine died in that valley, trying to make things right. Her daughter buried her there and left the coach as a memorial, but she did it alone, in grief and shock. I want to go back with Elizabeth and do it properly, mark the site clearly. Maybe place a stone with Catherine's name beside Thomas's cairn. Something that says their story mattered, that they're remembered." Agnes nodded approvingly. "That's good work. The kind that heals. And I want to write it all down," Mason continued. "Everything I've learned. Catherine's journal, Mary's research, Elizabeth's story. I want to put it together in a way that makes sense, so that future generations can understand what happened. Sarah might never read it, but maybe her children will, or their children. Maybe it will help them understand where they came from." "You're creating a legacy," Agnes said. "That's powerful medicine against grief." Mason looked at his hands, weathered and scarred from a lifetime of work. "I'm 55 years old. I've spent most of my life doing simple things, ranching, trapping, surviving, but this feels important in a way those things never did. Like maybe I was supposed to find that coach. Like maybe this is what I'm meant to do with whatever years I have left." Agnes reached over and patted his hand. "Purpose has a way of finding us when we're ready for it. You couldn't have done this work 3 years ago, right after Clara died. You weren't ready then. But you are now." They talked late into the night, planning the next day's expedition. Agnes couldn't make the journey herself. Her body wasn't up to hours in the saddle anymore, but she promised to have the minister from the church ready to say proper words over Catherine's grave when they returned. Mason walked back to the boarding house under a sky full of stars. The air was cold and still, and his breath came out in great white clouds. Somewhere out there, Sarah was living her life. He didn't know where, didn't know if she was happy or still searching, but for the first time since she'd left, he could think about her without the tight pain in his chest. She was following her nature, same as Catherine had, same as all the women in that line who'd felt the pull to move beyond the boundaries set for them. It wasn't abandonment, it was inheritance, and there was a kind of beauty in that, even through the pain. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Mason collected Elizabeth from the boarding house and brought her to the livery, where he'd arranged for a gentle mare. Elizabeth proved to be a competent rider, comfortable in the saddle despite years living in the city. "My grandmother taught me," she explained as they set out. "She said every woman should know how to ride well enough to save herself if she needed to." They rode through town and out into the valley, Copper plodding along beside Elizabeth's mare with his usual patient determination. Mason led them along the trail he now knew by heart, pointing out landmarks and sharing what he knew of the area's history. "This whole valley used to be Nez Perce hunting ground," he told Elizabeth. "Thomas running Bear's people. He would have known every stream and ridge, every place where game moved with the seasons. My grandmother said he was a good man, patient and kind. Catherine used to tell her stories about him, about his gentleness. 25 years together," Mason said. "That's a testament. They built something real." When they reached the spot and Elizabeth saw the stagecoach for the first time, she stopped her horse and just stared. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "It's exactly how my grandmother described it. I used to think maybe her memory had exaggerated, but no. It's really here. She really left this memorial." They dismounted and approached slowly. Mason showed Elizabeth the trunk, the documents, the carved message in the coach floor. Then they walked to Thomas's cairn, and Mason showed her where he believed Catherine must be buried about 20 feet away, in a spot where the ground would have been softer in November, easier to dig. "We need to mark it properly," Elizabeth said. "Let me help." They spent the next several hours working together. Mason had brought tools and a flat stone he'd purchased in town. While he dug carefully in the area he'd identified, Elizabeth cleaned and repaired Thomas's cairn, adding more stones and making sure it would withstand many more winters. Mason found what he was looking for about 3 feet down, fragments of wood that had once been a coffin, and beneath them, bones. He stopped immediately, treating the sight with reverence. This was Catherine, or what remained of her. A woman who'd fought for her freedom, built a life against tremendous odds, and died trying to make peace with her past. He didn't disturb the remains. Instead, he carefully refilled the excavation and placed the flat stone on top. Elizabeth had brought a small chisel, and together they carved words into the stone. Catherine Rose Blackwood running Bear, 1859 to 1919. Beloved sister, wife, mother, she ran toward love, she died, seeking peace. When the work was done, they stood together by the 2 cairns, 2 graves in a valley that had witnessed both love and loss. "Would you like to say something?" Mason asked. Elizabeth nodded. She pulled out the letter Catherine had written to Mary and read it aloud, her voice carrying across the empty valley. The words that had been meant for one sister, never delivered, now spoken over the grave by a great-granddaughter who'd never known her. When she finished, Mason added his own words. "Catherine, you made it farther than you thought. You didn't reach your sister in life, but your story reached her family. You're remembered with love, with understanding, with gratitude for the courage it took to live life on your own terms. Rest well. You earned it." They stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Elizabeth pulled something else from her bag, a small quilt square, hand-stitched with blue and yellow flowers. "This is from the quilt Catherine made," she explained. "My grandmother kept it her whole life, carried it everywhere. When she knew she was dying, she cut a square from it and gave it to me. She said, 'Take this to the valley someday. Leave it for Catherine.' I've been carrying it for 15 years, waiting for the right time." Elizabeth knelt and tucked the quilt square beneath the stone marker, protecting it from the wind. "Now you have something from home," she said softly. "Something from the daughter who loved you." They spent another hour at the site, taking in every detail, making sure the memorials were secure and would last. Mason added stones to both cairns, making them taller, more visible. Elizabeth placed wildflower seeds around the graves. They wouldn't bloom until spring, but when they did, they'd add color and life to the spot. Finally, as the sun began its afternoon descent, they prepared to leave. But before mounting their horses, Elizabeth turned to Mason. "Thank you for this, for finding her, for caring enough to do this properly. My grandmother's spirit can rest now, knowing the mission is complete." "I should be thanking you," Mason replied. "You helped me understand my own daughter better. That's a gift I'll carry the rest of my life." They rode back slowly, both of them feeling the weight and lightness that comes from completing important work. When they reached town, Agnes was waiting at her cottage with the minister, as promised. Mason and Elizabeth told them what they'd done, and the minister said a blessing for Catherine and Thomas for their love and their courage. That evening, Mason sat down in his room and began to write. He started with Catherine's journal entries, then added Mary's research, then his own discoveries, and finally Elizabeth's story. He wrote about inheritance, not just of blood and bone, but of spirit, about the pull that some people feel to move beyond boundaries, to seek something undefined but essential. He wrote about love that persists across distance and silence, about forgiveness that comes too late to be spoken but still matters, about the patterns that repeat through generations, not because we're doomed to them, but because they're part of who we are. And he wrote about acceptance, accepting that Sarah had to leave, accepting that he might never fully understand why, accepting that loving someone sometimes means letting them go completely. By the time he finished, the candle had burned low and his hand ached from hours of writing, but he had the story now, complete from beginning to end. Catherine's story, Mary's story, Sarah's story, his story, all woven together across decades, all connected by the thread of women who needed to run toward something only they could name. He sealed the pages in a leather folder, along with all the documents and letters. Someday, somehow, he'd make sure Sarah received it. Not as a demand or an accusation, but as a gift, the story of where she came from and why she might feel the pull she did. For now, though, it was enough to have done the work, to have given Catherine and Thomas proper recognition, to have helped Elizabeth complete her grandmother's mission, to have found understanding where before there was only hurt. Mason blew out the candle and lay down to sleep, feeling more at peace than he had in 8 years. 3 weeks after returning from the memorial site, Mason received a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by the mail rider who made the circuit through the mountain properties once a week. Mason had been splitting wood when the rider appeared, and he'd almost told him to just leave any mail in the box by the trail. But something made him walk over. Maybe it was the way the rider looked at him, with an expression that suggested he knew the envelope he carried was important. "This one came through a lot of channels," the rider said, handing over a thick envelope, postmarked from Seattle, forwarded from a place in Oregon, and before that he squinted at the faded marks. "Looks like it started somewhere in Alaska." Mason took the envelope with hands that had suddenly forgotten how to stay steady. There was no return address, but he recognized the handwriting immediately. Sarah's careful script, addressing the envelope to Mason Teller, High Country, Idaho. She'd found him. After 8 years of silence, she'd somehow found him. The rider tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Mason standing in the snow with the letter clutched in his hands. Copper wandered over from the lean-to, curious about the interruption to their routine. Mason scratched the donkey's ears absently, his mind racing. He should open it. He should tear it open right now and read whatever Sarah had written, but his hands wouldn't move. Fear held him frozen, fear that whatever was inside would hurt, would be another goodbye, would explain that she was never coming back and he needed to stop hoping. Finally, Copper nudged him hard enough to break the paralysis. Mason walked into the cabin, set the letter on the table, and built up the fire. He made coffee. He sat down. He stood up again. He paced. "Just open it," he said aloud. "Whatever it says, you can handle it." He picked up the envelope and broke the seal. Inside were several pages in Sarah's handwriting and something else, a photograph. Mason looked at the photograph first. It showed Sarah standing in front of a small log building with mountains in the background. She looked older, of course she did. 8 years had passed, but healthy, strong, alive. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a practical braid. She was smiling, really smiling, in a way he remembered from her childhood, and she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man, his hand on her shoulder, looking at her with obvious affection. Mason's throat tightened. She'd found someone, built a life, moved on completely. He set the photograph down and picked up the letter, making himself read despite the fear curling in his stomach. "Dear Dad," it began, "I don't know if this letter will reach you. I don't even know if you want to hear from me after all these years. But I'm writing anyway because I've learned something important and I need to share it with you. A few weeks ago, I was in Seattle visiting a friend who works at a historical society. We were talking about family history, and she mentioned that someone had recently been researching the Running Bear family, a man from Idaho who was trying to piece together a story about a woman named Catherine who'd run away in 1879. Dad, when she said that name, everything inside me stopped. Catherine Running Bear was Mum's great-great-great-aunt. I'd heard the story once when I was little. Mum told me about a woman in our family who disappeared into the mountains with the man she loved. My friend gave me contact information for Elizabeth Pritchard, the woman who'd been helping with the research. I wrote to her, and she wrote back. She told me everything about finding you in Coulter's Ridge, about the stagecoach and Catherine's memorial, about the letters and documents you'd discovered, and she sent me something you'd written. A document tracing Catherine's story from beginning to end and how it connected to us, to our family, to the women who came after her. Dad, when I read what you'd written about inheritance, about the pull some people feel to move, to search, to find something beyond boundaries, I cried for hours. You understood. After all these years, all the silence, all the hurt I caused, you finally understood. I left because I had to, not because of anything you did or didn't do. You were a wonderful father. You and Mum gave me everything, but there was something inside me that needed to move, needed to search. I didn't know how to explain it then. I barely understood it myself. I've been working in Alaska for the past 5 years, studying wolf migration patterns. It's remote, difficult work, but it feels right. I move with the seasons, follow the packs, live, in a way that lets me be in motion without being lost. And I met someone. His name is James. He's in the photograph. He's a wildlife biologist too. He understands the need to move. But here's what I learned from Catherine's story, from what you wrote. Catherine ran towards something specific. She knew what she wanted. I've been running too, but I didn't know what I was running toward. I thought if I kept moving, I'd eventually find it. Reading your document, seeing how you honored Catherine and Thomas, understanding how you made peace with my leaving Dad, that's what I was looking for. Not a place or a purpose or even understanding from others. I was looking for understanding from myself and permission to be who I am. You gave me that. Through Catherine's story, through your words, you gave me permission to be myself and still be your daughter. I'm coming home. Not to stay. I'll never be the staying kind. But to visit, to talk, to bridge the 8 years of silence. James, and I will be passing through Idaho in 2 weeks, and if you're willing to see me, I'd like to stop by the cabin. I'd like you to meet him. I'd like to tell you about the work I'm doing and hear about your life. And I'd like to visit Catherine's memorial with you. I'd like to pay my respects to the woman whose courage gave me permission to be brave. If you don't want to see me, I'll understand. I know I hurt you, but I hope you'll give me a chance to thank you in person for finding our family's story, for understanding, for loving me enough to let me go. Your daughter always, Sarah. Mason read the letter 3 times. Then he set it down, walked outside, and stood in the cold air, letting the wind dry the tears on his face. Copper came over and leaned against him, solid and warm, and Mason wrapped one arm around the donkey's neck. "She's coming home," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "She's coming home, not forever, not to stay, but to visit, to talk, to rebuild what had been lost." It was more than he'd hoped for, more than he'd let himself believe possible. Mason went back inside and picked up the photograph again. Sarah looked happy. The man beside her, James, had kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of time spent outdoors. He looked like someone who understood the wilderness, who wouldn't try to cage someone like Sarah. "Thank you," Mason said to the photograph to James. "Thank you for understanding her." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Mason cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, fixed the loose board on the porch step, repaired a crack in one of the windows. He stocked up on supplies in town, buying good coffee and fresh bread and the ingredients for the stew Clara used to make. He wanted everything to be right, to show Sarah that he'd been taking care of himself, that her absence hadn't destroyed him. Agnes came to visit halfway through the preparations, riding out in a neighbor's wagon despite the cold. She took one look at Mason's frantic activity and laughed. "She's going to love you, no matter what state the cabin's in," Agnes said. "You could greet her in a pigsty, and she'd just be happy to see you." "I know," Mason admitted, "but I need to do this. I need her to see that I'm all right, that life went on, that I'm not just sitting here drowning in grief." "Are you all right?" Agnes asked gently. Mason paused in his work, considering the question honestly. "I am now. I wasn't for a long time. But finding Catherine's story, understanding the inheritance, meeting Elizabeth, it gave me a way to make sense of what happened. And now Sarah's coming back. Not to stay, but that's okay. I don't need her to stay. I just need her to know I love her and understand her." Agnes nodded approvingly. "That's wisdom, Mason Teller. Hard won, but real." She stayed for a few hours, helping him organize the cabin and telling him about Elizabeth, who'd returned to Seattle but promised to visit. Again, in the spring, they talked about Catherine and Mary, about the memorial in the valley, about how sometimes the most important things we do are the ones that honor the past while releasing it. When Agnes left, she hugged Mason at the door, a rare gesture from the proper old woman. "This is going to go well," she said firmly. "Trust that." The day Sarah was due to arrive, Mason woke before dawn. He dressed carefully in clean clothes, combed his hair, and spent extra time making sure everything was perfect. He'd carved a simple wooden sign for the gravesite, something that could withstand weather better than the temporary marker they'd placed, and he'd wrapped it carefully to show Sarah when she arrived. Mid-morning, he heard the sound of horses on the trail. His heart started hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He walked out onto the porch, Copper beside him, and watched 2 riders come into view. Sarah, his daughter. Here, real, alive, home, she dismounted before the horses had fully stopped, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the distance of the yard. 8 years collapsed into nothing. She was older, yes, but she was still his Sarah. Still had Clara's eyes, and that particular way of tilting her head when she was uncertain. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice wavering. "Hi, sweetheart," Mason replied, and his voice broke completely on the last word. They closed the distance between them in seconds. Sarah crashed into his arms, and Mason held her tight, feeling her shake with sobs against his chest. He was crying too. Couldn't help it. 8 years of grief and longing and love, pouring out in tears that wouldn't stop. "I'm sorry," Sarah kept saying. "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." "Shh," Mason said, stroking her hair the way he had when she was small. "It's all right. You're here now. That's all that matters." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other, letting the years of silence dissolve. Finally, Sarah pulled back enough to look at him, her face wet with tears. "You understood," she said. "Through Catherine's story, you understood why I had to go." "I did," Mason agreed. "You're like her, like all the women in that line. You need to move. It's in your blood. But I want to come back too," Sarah said. "Not to stay, but to visit." to be part of your life, even if I can't be here all the time. Is that okay?" "It's more than okay," Mason said. "It's everything." James had dismounted and was standing a respectful distance away, giving them space. Mason looked over Sarah's shoulder at him and nodded. "You must be James." "Yes, sir," James said, coming forward. "It's an honor to meet you." Mason shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "Thank you for taking care of her, and for bringing her home." "She brought herself home," James said. "I just came along for the ride." Sarah laughed, the sound breaking through the partin. Tears. "Come inside, both of you. I want to hear everything about Catherine and the memorial. I want to understand the whole story." They went into the cabin, and Mason made coffee while Sarah and James settled at the table. Copper stuck his head in the door, curious about the visitors, and Sarah laughed again, a sound Mason had thought he might never hear again. "Is that Copper? Dad, he's gotten old." "We both have," Mason said, "but we're still standing." And they were, both of them still standing, still here, still connected despite the years and distance. The silence had been broken, the story had come full circle, and whatever came next, they would face it together, not in the same place, but in the same family, bound by love that had proven stronger than absence. They spent 3 days together at the cabin, talking until late into the night, filling in the years of silence with stories and explanations. Sarah told him about Alaska, about following wolf packs through pristine wilderness, about the work that felt like calling rather than career. James proved to be easy company, thoughtful and quiet, content to listen and only speaking when he had something worth saying. Mason told them about finding the stagecoach, about meeting Elizabeth, about piecing together Catherine's story. He showed them the documents, the letters, the photograph of Mary. Sarah held the locket with Mary's picture and stared at it for a long time. "I look just like her," she said, wonder in her voice. "I never knew. Mom never showed me this photograph." "Maybe she didn't know how much the resemblance would mean to you," Mason suggested. "Or maybe she was protecting you from a story she thought might hurt." "Or maybe," Sarah said slowly, "she was waiting for the right time to tell me, and that time never came." They were all silent for a moment, thinking about Clara, about what she'd known and what she'd hoped for. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "I want to see the memorial. Can we go tomorrow?" So the next morning, all three of them rode out to the valley, Mason on foot with Copper, Sarah and James on their horses. The day was clear and cold, the kind of winter morning where the air sparkled with ice crystals and every breath felt like a gift. When they reached the stagecoach, Sarah dismounted slowly, taking in the scene with careful attention. She walked around the coach, touched the weathered wood, looked inside at the empty space where Catherine's trunk had sat. Then she walked to the graves, to the cairns Mason and Elizabeth had built, to the stone markers with their careful inscriptions. She knelt in the snow beside Catherine's grave and placed her hand on the stone. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for running. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for showing me it was possible." James stood back, giving her space, but Mason came to kneel beside his daughter. Together they read the words on the stone. She ran toward love. She died seeking peace. "She almost made it," Sarah said. "She almost reached her sister." "She did make it," Mason replied. "Maybe not in the way she intended, but her story reached Mary's family. Elizabeth completed the journey for her. And now you're here, understanding the inheritance she left you." Sarah looked at her father, eyes bright with tears. "Do you really understand now? Why I had to leave?" "I do," Mason said. "It wasn't about me or your mother or anything we did wrong. It was about something in your blood, in your spirit. You needed to move the way some people need to breathe. I spent years thinking I'd failed you, but I was wrong. You were just following your nature." "I hurt you anyway," Sarah said. "I know I did." "Yes," Mason agreed. "But hurt heals. And now we have a chance to build something new. Not what we had before, we can't go back to that. But something honest, something that accepts who you really are." They stood together, and Sarah pulled the wooden. Sign Mason had carved from Copper's pack. Together, they placed it beside the stone marker, driving it deep into the frozen ground so it would stand firm through whatever weather came. "This valley is sacred now," Sarah said. "Catherine and Thomas here, their love preserved in stone and memory." "All valleys are sacred," James said quietly, speaking for the first time that morning. "Every place where people fought for their right to be themselves. Every place where love proved stronger than fear." They spent another hour at the site, Sarah asking questions about the discovery, about Elizabeth, about Mary's long years of waiting. Mason told her everything, holding nothing back, and Sarah listened with the intensity she'd always brought to stories when she was a child. Finally, as the sun reached its peak, they prepared to leave. But before mounting her horse, Sarah turned to Mason one more time. "I'm leaving again tomorrow," she said. "Back to Alaska, back to the work. But I'll write now, regular letters. And I'll come back to visit. Not often the work keeps me remote for months at a time, but when I can." "Is that enough?" Mason pulled her into a hug. "It's more than enough. You're living your life, following your path. That's all I ever wanted for you, even when I didn't understand what that path looked like." "What about you?" Sarah asked. "What will you do now?" Mason thought about that. The cabin waited, the mountains surrounded him, Copper needed his daily care. But there was more now, too. There was purpose. "I'm going to finish writing Catherine's story properly," he said. "Turn it into something complete, something future generations can read and understand. And I'm going to take care of this memorial, make sure it's maintained and remembered. Agnes wants to work with the Historical Society to have it officially recognized. I'll help with that." "That's good work, Dad. Important work." "So is yours," Mason replied. "Following those wolves, understanding their patterns. We're both doing what we're meant to do now." They rode back to the cabin together, and that evening they made Clara's stew, all three of them working in the small kitchen, laughing and talking. Mason felt Clara's presence in the cabin that night, as if she was there with them, finally at peace, knowing her family had found their way back to each other. The next morning, Sarah and James prepared to leave. Mason packed food for their journey and stood in the yard, watching them mount their horses. Sarah came over for one last hug. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. Stay safe. Write when you can. I will. I promise." They rode off down the trail, and Mason stood watching until they disappeared around the bend. Then he turned to Copper, who'd been waiting patiently beside him. "Well, old friend," he said, "it's just us again. But it's different now, isn't it?" Copper snorted agreement. Mason looked up at the mountains, at the vast sky. Above them, at the wilderness that stretched in every direction, he thought about Catherine, running toward love, about Mary, watching and waiting, about Sarah, following her path through wild places, about himself, finding purpose in understanding and preserving their stories. Sometimes the hardest journey isn't the one through snow and ice, but the one back to the people we've lost. But sometimes, with patience and understanding, with willingness to accept people as they are rather than as we wish them to be, that journey ends not in arrival but in peace. Mason Teller had found his peace. His daughter was out there somewhere, living her life, following her nature. She would write, she would visit, and when she did, he would be here, steady as the mountains, loving her without condition or expectation. The cabin needed firewood, Copper needed feeding, life needed living. Mason smiled and got to work, knowing that sometimes the simplest things, survival, routine, care, were enough. More than enough. They were everything.